thank you very much, all of you, for being here. This, as you know, is the first colloquium of 2017. And I am personally very happy and honored to have Andy Hanssen today here. Andy is a professor of economics at Clemson University. And I met Andy, I kind of fought with Dean over who was going to introduce Andy and moderate the colloquium today, because Andy and I go way back as things go. I first met him in 2010 in a seminar on ancient Greek economic development at Stanford. And I thought it was just because of my bad English that I misunderstood that he was really an economist. It turns out that he was really like a real economist. So that was amazing. He and Rob Fleck, his co-author on this paper and many other papers on Athens and Greece, are probably the first, if perhaps not any longer, the only economists who are really have taken an interest in ancient Greece, for which I am personally grateful, and always, I'm always interested in hearing what's going on with Rob and Andy, because they usually have some really interesting things to say about ancient Athens, and this is one of those cases. I've seen this paper last June when they presented it at the COE meeting in Paris, and I am really excited to talk about it in this new instantiation. As always, Andy will have 5 minutes to kind of like introduce and guide the discussion, and then the floor will be open. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and I will put you on the queue. Thank you again for being here, Andy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the very nice introduction. And let me say in return that Federica is part of a group at Stanford University, as some of you or all of you may know, that really has been at the forefront of applying social science methods to the ancient world. I guess Josh Ober, your advisor, has sort of led the charge, but I mean, people like Barry Weingast have been involved, now Gillian Hatfield, and not to mention innumerable, classicists of Federica's ilk. So I think it's a wonderful development in that field, and something from which I certainly, along with my co-author Rob, have benefited a lot. Let me stand up, if you don't mind. I'm used to standing. I'm going to be making comments. But I'd like to thank not only Federica for the introduction, I'd like to thank Lee for inviting me here to be at the Ostrom Institute, Dean for encouraging me to come out here and showing me hospitality while I've been out here. And it's been a lot of fun, so I'm going to be here for the semester on and off. This is joint work, as Federica mentioned, with Rob Fleck, with whom I've written a number of papers on the political and legal institutions of ancient Greece. And in this one, we look at the establishment of the rule of law, we call it, in Athens in the 4th century. And we're not unique in calling it that. Federica calls it that. Lots of classicists call it that. But what we're really looking at, to be a little more precise, is we're looking at the fact that in the 5th century, Athens operated a system that was largely unconstrained, ruled by the popular assembly, in which all citizens belonged. So in other words, it was what we call rule by majority. The law, as a sort of an approximation, was what the majority decided at that moment the law would be. At the end of the 5th century, Athens changed its institutions. In the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, it established a number of constraints on assembly decision-making, wrote down the law, set up procedures for applying the law, and a number of other things, and created what looks much more like a modern rule of law. Now, I think one of the striking features of this whole thing was Athens was enormously successful in the 5th century under its rule by majority system. It was enormously successful in the 4th century under its rule by law system. It reached peaks of income twice, in the middle of the 5th and the middle of the 4th century, according to estimates by Josh Ober. And our argument in this paper is that each system was appropriate to the circumstances of its time. In other words, the rule of law, establishing rule of law, has a cost. And that cost, the trade-off involved, is at the heart of this paper. Now, in the modern world, there's a tendency to think of the rule of law as simply an example of good institutions. Countries that have good institutions, they operate according to a rule of law. And that's understandable given that, countries that operate according to rule of law have higher levels of income, higher rates of economic growth, higher levels of personal liberty, a lot of very good things. But this does come at a cost. And to illustrate the cost, I'd like to just show a couple of quotes here by two famous Greeks. The first one is Aristotle expressing what is probably the view that modern scholars mostly would hold, that rightly constituted law should be the final sovereign. In other words, that rule of law is a good thing. But the cost of that, I think, is illustrated by this quote from Plato, where the good king rules, law is an obstacle standing in the way of justice. In other words, if you have a ruler, be it a king or a majority or whatever, who is benevolent and omniscient, you do not want to constrain that ruler. Any constraint is going to move you away from the first best. Okay? Now, of course, in the real world, benevolent, omniscient rulers are rare, so it may be optimal to constrain. Okay? But there is a trade-off. You can let someone make unconstrained decision, give them maximum flexibility to adjust policy in response to changing circumstances, because circumstances are always changing. Or you can constrain them, you can tie their hands. Tying their hands promotes commitment, but at the cost of flexibility. And that's the trade-off that's at the heart of this paper, and that's the trade-off that we model. Also at the heart of the paper is the idea that all political institutions are second best, okay? You're giving up on some dimension. Achieving the first best is generally not possible, and so what you're doing is you're making a choice among second best institutions, and in this case it's going to depend on this trade-off here is what we argue, and we argue that that basically applied to Athens. In the 5th century, Athens was the head of an empire. Tribute collected from empire states were its most important source of public revenue. In those circumstances, incentives were pretty broadly aligned across the citizen body regarding empire policy. So the gains from committing to policy were relatively small. The ability to react quickly, given the demands of empire and managing an empire, was very valuable. So in this circumstance, unchecked assembly rule was the preferable, institutional setting. So rule by majority was preferable. At the end of the 5th century, after losing the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian Empire is dissolved. Athens, from then on, is a commercial state competing with other commercial states in a manner much like states compete in the modern world. At that point, credible commitment becomes much more important because you're committing to contracts. It's the principal means, or element on which you're competing is your contract supporting and commerce supporting institutions. And checks on the assembly are established, and they're creating a de facto rule of law. So that's our story in a nutshell. I'm probably close to being out of my 5 minutes, but we do then think that this has implications beyond just ancient Greece, implications both for understanding the rule of law is endogenous in the modern world, and for thinking about circumstances where the rule of law may be beneficial or may not be beneficial in the modern world as well. And with my 5 minutes up, I will stop.
Thank you, Andy.
So I have a question. I have two questions from Gustavo Torrens, who's listening from Argentina. And so I'm just going to read these to you. Regarding the model, I wonder if the rule of law rather than the ex-ante committed policy could be better modeled as a restriction on the range of options selected by the majority. I understand that what they have is an extreme version of what I'm proposing. In their model, the restricted range is just 1 point. But I think it would be interesting to explore the more general version I'm proposing. After all, in many cases, rule of law means that discretionary power can select policies, but within limits imposed by a constitution, Bill of Rights, and so on. In my version, you can also distinguish different intensities of the rule of law. And the second question, on a more substantial note, I'm not sure that majority rule is a system that will allow the government to react promptly to shocks. Indeed, for decisions that require very fast reactions, it is common to concentrate authority or otherwise use a protocol. For example, I have in mind military decisions. So there you have it.
Okay, well, good. Those are two very good questions. In terms of the model, it's absolutely right. This is a very simple model. We're trying to get at the essence of the rule of law. I think we could make it a more complicated model. Maybe that is worth doing. But really, the goal of the model is to show in a very simple way the nature of the trade-off, and that's all we succeed in doing. But whether there would be something to be gained by making it a wider range of choices, that's a good question. That's something we can think about a little bit. In terms of majority rule reacting promptly, I mean, you have to understand that in ancient Greece, this is direct democracy. Okay, it's not like here where you're delegating decisions. I mean, you're really delegating practically nothing. There, decisions are being made by the assembly. I mean, I'm exaggerating only slightly. And so it's not like you have your group that you say, okay, we're going to delegate this to the Armed Services Committee in Congress. There is no Armed Service Committee. There is no Congress. There is simply the Athenians meeting in assembly and voting on these things. Okay, so now in some kind of an emergency. So for example, a commander's in the field. The commander has to make a decision on his own because he doesn't have the assembly there. But even in those circumstances, there are instances where the commander will send back to Athens for the assembly's permission to do something. Okay, because the assembly did not take it kindly for a commander to take too much initiative, particularly if that failed. So it's not quite like a modern representative democracy where the notion of establishing power in specialized bodies is what we expect. Furthermore, you could push it a little beyond that, and Rob and I have a different paper about this. The Greeks went out of their way to avoid having experts or avoid having concentrations of powers in any kind of way. Okay, most public offices were chosen by lot. People were not allowed to repeat in their public offices. People rotated in bodies like the council that set the agenda for the assembly. They were also chosen by lot. Jurors were chosen by lot. The Greeks were very, very concerned not to delegate power to individuals or groups in a way that could be abused. And so basically that was in the Greek setting. In the modern setting, it makes perfect sense that you'd say, right, at times of emergency, we delegate to a small group. In the Greek setting, that was generally not. Or at least in the Athenian setting, that would not have been the case.
Can I follow on just a little bit?
Sure.
I wish we could document that a little bit more. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that they voted literally on every little thing and they had to assign tasks to a bureaucracy or some officials, right? I mean, so there is some, I think his point is good, that Gustavo's point is good. There's a range of decisions and jurisdictions over which, a rule of law might apply and a direct democracy force might apply. And that might, there might be more richness in the institutions and the data that you could exploit along this dimension.
Well, let's be clear. When you talk about data, the data is fairly crude. We don't have data on actual public decisions made and things like that. What we do, so we can't, it's not like we could go through and say, here are the series of things they voted on. What we know is the structure of these different organizations. And the bottom line was that with a few exceptions, offices were chosen by lot. This person served a year, was audited at the end of the year for their performance and that public duty, and then they stepped down, and that was that. And that was basically the way it was done. There were no bureaucracies in that sense. The closest thing to a smaller body with power was this council that would set the agenda for the assembly, and even they rotated in their membership. And so there really was not anything to delegate to. And again, it makes
I find that almost impossible to believe because we have literature on small groups of religious sects that have maybe 100, 200 members, and even they, in their so-called direct democracy, don't have direct democracy over all these decisions. Here you're talking about a society that's got, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands.
Maybe I'm being too unsubtle. I'll pass it to Federica as an expert. Maybe you can comment on that.
I just wonder if you could, to the extent you could, detail that more in the paper.
Let me pass the ball to Eric, who is a historian of ancient Athens.
Basically, you have it right. It was remarkably bureaucracy-free. What there were these boards of officials that would just serve for 1 year. They weren't experts. There might be a bit of continuing expertise in secretaries who might continue, who weren't the actual official. But in general, there weren't large bodies that sort of continued on bureaucratically. But for decisions, if someone was going to be condemned or taxes were going to be paid, some money was going to be, a contract was going to be let, they would refer it to ex-board of officials who were serving for just 1 year. And then they would do what they were supposed to do, but it was very bureaucracy-free. There's a little bit more testimony on the laws that are being passed than you suggest. What it is just haphazard. It's whatever happens to show up in a historical narrative, that Thucydides writes or Herodotus writes, or in some courtroom speech referencing particular events. We do not have a catalog of these were the laws that were passed in this year or something. Your data is completely missing that way. But there is this haphazard sort of narrative of events that you can use to build, patterns.
Yeah, that absolutely is true. I mean, we've thought on and off about going to that, but because it is so haphazard, it's a little bit difficult to sort of have any kind of a sort of time series pattern and say, here was what was going on in the 5th century in terms of the kinds of laws passed. Here was going on in the 4th century. I mean, my understanding is almost all of these speeches are from the 4th century, and they're just something that's survived. But in any case, you're right. I think that is a potentially interesting source of data we haven't plumbed to its full depth.
Look, I'm gonna jump in on this unless you guys have something specific on the topic, because I want to go back to the kind of like the essence of Gustavo's original question, which is like, is majority rule in the way that it was carried out in Athens a way that allows the government to react promptly, right? And here the question is, in a way, what you have to respond to somehow is the sense that comes out from Thucydides most clearly, but from other instantiations of broad citizen-centered government in antiquity, where when things go south, it's better to send one man. And this is like the Roman dictatorship is probably the best instantiation of this. You don't have anything quite like this in ancient Athens, but Thucydides is very clear about the fact that a bunch of known experts sitting on a hill is a really problematic and time-consuming and conflictual way of making decisions. This is indeed, if we believe some interpretations of the histories, the reason why democracy in Athens is just simply a subpar system, unless we have Pericles, in which case he's really the one that's making all the decisions and everyone else is like applauding. Which is obviously a very skewed way of looking at the procedural mechanisms in the assembly in the 5th century, but it is, in a way, an objection that would come up. And perhaps you can easily say, this is way too historical to even address this for these purposes, and I got...
Right. Well, this again gets very much into this other paper we wrote on the legal system. I mean, the Athenians were very clear that they did not trust experts. They did a lot to avoid experts, and they did a lot to avoid concentrating power in smaller bodies. I mean, that was not a chance thing. That was on purpose. And developing this, what was called radical democracy of the 5th century, they disempowered a series of these kinds of specialized institutions. So that was part of their goal, and they recognized it came at a cost. They, and again, this is all coming from a different paper, but they took actions to try to mitigate some of these costs in ways that they could without establishing sort of independent power centers. Now we have to remember, that Athens established a democracy after a lot of factional infighting that had lasted, a good part of a century, a good part of the previous century. Infighting and dictatorship. The Greeks themselves, they feared factional fighting. I mean, that was the thing Greek states feared above all else, was this dissolving into these civil wars over factions. So Athens went out of its way to make sure these possible centers of power didn't arise. So again, this comes back to the notion of second best world. In the first best world, you have experts making decisions like Plato, well, not up there anymore, like Plato's king, okay? That's the first best world. You got that kind of king, you've got that kind of power center, you make that decision. Okay, the Athenians have chosen not to do that, all right? And that's again, all part and parcel of this bundle of institutions that they are establishing. Now, they never move away from their distrust of experts, but they do move towards a constraining the assembly. So they set up constraints, but the constraints are for the most part not based on establishing permanent boards of experts, but rather based on setting up legal procedures and legal institutions that are again manned by lottery, rotating bodies who serve in these positions.
Thank you, Kirk.
Thanks for sharing this. This was really compelling and interesting to me. I'm wondering how your paper speaks to some of the literature about rents and rent seeking as sort of inimical to democracy. So it sounds like the tribute that it sounds like it's possible to understand the tribute that Athens was receiving from the other members of the Delian League as a form of rent, which once that gravy train sort of dries up, they have to commit to democracy in order to thrive. And then, so is that sort of a correct interpretation of this? and then the other part of the question is, I'm wondering if there are other historical examples of instances where you had kind of these absolutist democracies. So you had a democracy that was unconstrained by law, because dictatorships are often, almost always, absolutists, not constrained by law. But do you have any examples of sort of historical examples of democracies that are unconstrained by law?
Yeah, and I should be a little bit clearer. Now, the Greeks always operated according to a rule. Just in the 5th century, the rule was that the law is what the assembly says the law is, as an approximation. So it wasn't that it was sort of one day they did this and one day they did that completely willy-nilly. The majority was the one deciding. So so there was a rule. I don't know of any other democracy that was radical to that same degree. I do not believe, though I'm certainly ready to be corrected, that there were other Greek democracies that were radical to that degree. Now, that said, and we can find out about that, but that's, and do please jump in if there is, but, there were 1,000 or more Greek polis in the classical and archaic period, and we know detail about the political institutions for a tiny, tiny fraction of them. So, only a few. So it's a little bit hard to say, to answer that question. At least I can't answer that question. You have to talk to someone who knows more about ancient Greece than I can to answer that one. What was your first question again? Was about...
The first question was whether or not the tributes from the Delian League are rents, and so, to what extent is your argument different than the arguments that rents, are bad for democratization?
That's an interesting. I hadn't thought of the bad for democratization thing. You could think of them as rents. You could think of them as fees for keeping the seas safe. One way to think about it, and I don't know that this is correct. I've suggested a number of times. I haven't had anyone buy in on it, but is that basically during the 5th century, Athens was the police force for the entire Aegean, and states paid a fixed annual fee for these services. Subsequently, in the 4th century, Athens was still the police force for the entire Aegean. They still kept their empire, but rather than each state paying a fixed fee, what happened was Athens charged in the form of harbor duties at their own port, which set up a very different set of incentives for them right there. So I don't know if I would think about them as rents or fees, but beyond that fact, that flow, it is a sort of an interesting idea, because you've got this whole resource curse literature, which I presume that sort of suggests that in the absence of, that can impede the development of democracy. In this case here, it seems to have had exactly the reverse effect, and really scholars dating back to Thucydides have suggested that the radical democracy Athens established in the 5th century was the logical outgrowth of its empire, and that it was the logical fulfillment of the empire. And given the empire, radical democracy is what they needed to have. And so these revenues from the empire, they were broadly distributed. They weren't collected by a small group. Again, Athens was very concerned of power being concentrated in small hands. So they were broadly distributed, which had the effect of aligning incentives in the sense that we sort of described in this paper, and therefore rendering the value of commitment that much less, we argue. But it was, they weren't rents going into the pockets of a small minority, which is what we typically think about with the resource curse. They were revenues that were broadly distributed, and the benefits which, basically were shared with Athens of all social classes.
Yeah.
So.
I got Nikos and then Eric.
So in your conclusion, you make the connection between how the model could be applied to current political systems. And there's a statement in the last paragraph you're saying, suppose that Greece, and you're referring to modern Greece, had established a rule by majority system in which the repayment of public debts remained conditional on the electorate favoring repayment. And it's not clear to me what you mean here. Are you saying that the electorate did not encourage repayment of debts, and that in a different system they would proceed to do that?
No, quite the contrary.
Okay.
Right now they're in a system where their electorate cannot decide. So their electorate has committed, in essence. This is just a parallel for the conclusion, but the idea would be that by joining the European Union, Greece did this consciously as a number of ways. They give up, they're giving up the right to devalue their currency in essence. So they are committing, therefore, to repay their debts is another way to say the same thing, because they're no longer going to devalue the currency. Had they ruled by majority, right now they could vote and say, we're not going to repay the debts. Had they ruled by majority, of course, they wouldn't have been able to borrow as much in the first place. But given where the Greeks are today, we just speculate that might be a better outcome. So that's what we're saying, that if they had maintained rule by majority, hadn't joined the euro, been able to default, they would not have been able to borrow as much. Therefore, when they came time to default, it would not have been as costly to default. They could have defaulted in the form of devaluation, which is how they had traditionally defaulted.
And would you consider a referendum as a rule by majority kind of institution? Because Greece had that referendum in July of 2015.
Yes,
the vote was a vote against repayment of the current structure of the debt, which did not proceed this way because of the pressures that were applied by the elites in Europe. So I wonder if the current way that we perceive rule of law is that example of the referendum.
Well, the reason that you I think this is a very important point. The reason you want to credibly commit is because ex post you're going to want to do something different. So basically what I do is, when if I'm going to, the typical example, borrowing is a good example. So I go to the bank and I say I want to borrow this money, and I say I'm going to tie my hands. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, if I don't pay it back, you have the right to cut off my hand. Okay, this is going to commit me to it. Now later, what would I like to do? Well, I'd like to not pay it back. I wish I hadn't signed this silly thing, but I'm stuck. And I think that we could think of it. I don't want to push this too far. This is sort of just speculating. We can think of the euro as, joining the euro as a commitment to that. That's exactly what a commitment device does. It ties their hands. Because ex post, they're not going to want to pay it back, but it's going to make them pay it back. And what we're speculating is maybe the circumstance that wasn't a good idea to do. They shouldn't have tied their hands that way. So yeah, sure, the majority doesn't want to do it after the fact, but that's why they joined the euro in the first place, so that they wouldn't be able to default after the fact.
I disagree, but I will hold my disagreement for after the seminar.
Eric.
Okay, thank you for this very interesting paper. I want to start by quickly addressing some things that have come up. You asked about democracies that acted, tyrannically, essentially. Mm-hmm. Well, philosophers like Aristotle thought that was Athens, and there were other democracies, according to Aristotle, that fit a certain type, where very much like the 5th century system you're describing here, where rule of law doesn't apply because the majority of poor schmucks who show up in assembly and they just do what they want on whatever crazy emotional basis they do, and this isn't a constitutional system, this is tyranny. They call it democracy, but it's tyranny. So, according to political theorists, that sort of system was Athens in the 5th century and other places in the Greek world as well. And I would, based on my research, say there were definitely other democracies that were this unconstrained. Let's say I wouldn't agree with Aristotle that they're tyrannies, but they're unconstrained in a similar way. But my question for you is, you set up this intriguing model where basically the 5th century system, the more unconstrained system, suited the times, the empire, the need to make quick decisions without being bound by sort of rule of law, a time-consuming process, including adherence to rule of law, you say on page 15. And then the 4th century, they have the more constrained system. They don't have the empire. They don't have the sort of need for immediate reaction to things. The problem with that formulation is that even in the 4th century, the assembly can still meet and take a decision just like that on a matter of an immediate decision being required. The real distinction that's being set up in the 4th century is between temporary laws, just sort of not really laws, but decisions by the assembly that are going to be enacted for a one-time circumstance, psephisma, just a vote to decide something, versus nomos, a law, which is a more permanent thing. And yes, there's a cumbersome procedure for a law. You've got to basically have a separate committee established, and they have an argument, and Some people support the old way of doing things. Some people support the new law, and it's a long time-consuming process. But, oh my gosh, such and such a place is rebelling. We need to send 20 ships right now. That can get decided in the 4th century just as immediately as the 5th century. So I think that breaks down, the contrast you're trying to draw here, making, making the system, a 5th century system, appropriate to the 5th century. I won't deny that in the 5th century there was more cause. Because of the imperial entanglements of Athens, there were more emergencies and such. But the logic wouldn't have been in the 4th century, oh, we don't need to, we can react slowly to stuff, so we'll do this rule of law process. They could still react rapidly when there was an emergency of some kind. Anyway.
Yeah, well, no, I agree with you, and perhaps we're not being subtle enough in our description of this, because in our model, it's basically you commit and you're committed forever. In the real world, that's not what rule of law does. Rule of law does, in essence, set up cumbersome processes. I mean, there's really no rule that we cannot change in the United States. But it may entail a very cumbersome process that could even involve changing the underlying constitution. Okay, so really the rule of law, I think of, as we're thinking about it in this paper, is producing a stability by making the process of change cumbersome. And so that's really what we're talking about in the case of Athens there. Now, at the same time, you're absolutely right. In times of emergency, the assembly could act very quickly, just as in times of emergency, government of the United States can act very quickly. And in fact, in times of true emergency, a government can declare something like martial law and simply say, right, we are now, superseding everything. The emergency is great enough. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I don't disagree in the slightest. But I think that is what we're trying to say in our paper here. And I agree. It's a little bit of a balancing act. It wasn't that. And maybe we should, I think the big thing, the big change, and maybe we're not clear enough about this in the paper, the big change from the 5th to the 4th century is the value of commitment goes way up. And it's not necessarily that the value of responding to information goes down by a huge amount, though I suppose one could argue that maybe it does go down by some. But it's really the value, because now, you're committing to contract. That's your source of wealth. You're basically, your wealth is now all based on taxes. Based on taxes of various types, harbor duties, taxes on the wealthy and all. And taxes, that's where commitment problems arise in the modern world too. And those are, if people don't know, if people aren't confident that you're going to commit to certain rates and that kind of thing, people aren't going to be comfortable using this stuff. So I think that, I think I agree with what you're saying, and we may just not have expressed ourselves well enough to sort of bring that out.
I think that, it's just where you're contrasting the two with respect to military needs around page 15. That's where you run into problems, sort of implying that in the 4th century they couldn't react quickly. And they knew that, and they committed to a system where they couldn't react quickly because they didn't need to react quickly because they don't have an empire. Well, they could react just as quickly as before.
Okay.
But in a more general sense, supporting your thesis about commitment, you could say that the 4th century was more cumbersome, even in quick decisions, because of the graphe paranomon. So it was one of the greatest change, I would say, going from 5th to 4th in terms of legal encumbrance is what I said before. This process for passing permanent laws got much slower. Quick decisions were just as quick as before, but permanent laws were much slower. But even quick decisions, what we find in the 4th century is that there's a procedure we read a lot about in the courtroom speeches, the graphe paranomon, where you accuse someone of proposing a law or a decision in the assembly that goes against the laws of Athens. And now the problem here actually is they may have had the same procedure in the 5th century, and we just don't hear about it because our bases of evidence are different in 5th and 4th. We don't have as many courtroom speeches in the 5th century. So maybe they did have a graphe paranomon and no one talked about it. But we know that it was a very common political maneuver in the 4th century to accuse your opponent who proposed it could be an emergency expedition to such and such a place. If that policy fails, one of the political opponents of the person who proposed that policy could come back to them later and say, you proposed an illegal law, what they mean is you proposed bad policy, you screwed us up. I'm going to bring you to trial on charges. And you could say that if the existence of the graphic polynomial and the use of it by politicians might put a damper on the willingness of people to, in an emergency, propose an extreme measure. It's more indirect than I think the way you put it in the paper, but you could make the argument that is part of the rule of law and part of the commitment that slows everything down. But nevertheless, the truth still is that the assembly itself in an emergency could just decide whatever it wanted to. But I'll leave it there.
I'm going to hold back because otherwise it's going to take too long. You have a point on this, so Boba, and maybe we can come back.
So my understanding is that main motivation of moving towards a rule of law were economic reasons, right? So they basically lost the revenue, and they needed to introduce some kind of more complex system of contracts and all that. And so, so you state that they actually even surpassed the level of wealth they had before. So apparently it worked. But can you indicate the channels through it worked? Like, was it like some particular sectors of the economy which boomed because of this rule of law compared to others? I know it might be like too much to ask given the level of like how far that happened in the past. And so the second question, and somehow I maybe missed that. So my understanding also is that so what kind of like democracy maybe ensures to a large extent is that you are more safe in terms of some kind of retaliation from the king, so you can more openly express your opinions on various issues, and so the system kind of like provides safeguards. So was that part of also switching from this tyranny towards the rule of law, in your opinion? Thanks.
Let me see. In terms of the first one, and again, I'm willing to. I'd love to hear otherwise, but I don't believe there's much information that would enable you to say different sectors were affected differently. I mean, what was clear was that Athens had tremendous concern with the sanctity of contracts in the 4th century. Presumably, contracting was valuable in the 5th century too. Athens was always a commercial power, but just it came at a higher cost then, because basically you wanted to maintain the empire, you wanted to be able to react fairly quickly to that. Let's see, I've lost. So we do know that there was a lot of emphasis on contract. We know that the contracts that were signed were very, very complex. And with lots of contingencies. I mean, really quite interesting contracts. But again, we all know this all in a sort of an unsystematic way. We know it from engravings that have survived. Okay. So that we know, but exactly which sectors boomed and which didn't, we don't know. We do know that Athens depended on taxes for its public revenue afterwards. Harbor duties were the most important one, and taxes on the wealthy. The wealthy were wealthy because they were trading, and so we know trade was very important, but beyond that, we don't really know. In terms of expressing public opinion, I mean, democracy may be greater than a king. I mean, the democracy did sentence Socrates for expressing his opinion in a famous instance. So you're not necessarily safe. A democracy can act in that kind of way too. The Greeks had a tremendous fear. The Athenians, at least, had a tremendous fear of tyranny. They had experienced tyranny in the 600s, and so a lot of their institutions were geared to making sure a tyrant did not arise again. So the concern with tyranny was certainly very, very great for a variety of reasons. I'm not sure how much was your ability to express your opinion freely, or how much was something else.
And this is also part of the constitutional changes at the end of the 5th century. Mm-hmm. The emphasis on anti-tyranny legislation. Yep. Sorry, Jimmy.
So Andy, as this conversation is going on, I started thinking about: is this paper about the Greeks, or is it about testing this model? And it seems like to me if it's about testing the model, there's probably, I don't have it off the top of my head other than running experiments, but there's probably better ways to test this model. When do you find groups moving from sort of loose contracts to, or laws to more general? And I think the problem with, so it's a nice story about the Greeks, but really to make it a better sell in some sense, it kind of comes back to, I think what was being discussed earlier would be, if you had sort of this dialogue going on that you could say that these guys were really talking about, let's change our way of doing things from this to this, from this more democratic process to this well-defined laws and things like that. And it sounds like you don't have that. So you're kind of stuck in, well, okay, this fits the model, but what if they had not done this? You just wouldn't be looking at this question in some sense with the Greeks.
Could think of writing a book on that.
But I started thinking, all right, so this is off the wall. This is off the wall. But there's got to be other examples of where people start to use more specific contracts. I think your model would say they go from very loose contracts or looser contracts, more loose contracts to more specific. So I'll give you one example off the top of my head, is marriage. And there's cases where you have prenuptial agreements and those that you don't. And where do you find those agreements? I think you find them when people start to realize there are big, big, big reasons for having them. There's big consequences. And that seems like to me, in a rough sense, marriage without those is more like democracy, and marriage with those is more like very, very specific rules of law going into it. And in some sense, these guys wouldn't be getting married if they could not have these prenuptial agreements. So have you thought about it from the perspective of are there other examples or that would push the model to have to predict in those cases? I guess that's the question.
Well, let me answer actually your couple of different questions. First, in terms of dialogue, we don't have a dialogue in sense we don't have the minutes of the debates that were held in the assembly. But what we do know is the Greece was a direct democracy. So this was the Greeks voting to constrain themselves directly. All of them voting, we are going to impose these constraints on themselves. And I think we can deduce from that that they had this in mind. That this wasn't a small group over there saying, let's set up this system, while the vast majority states, rationally.
So in some sense, you think you have an argument that there were rationale that they were doing. They were rational.
Absolutely, and I think that's very important to our paper, to our interpretation of the model, is this notion that they're voting themselves to impose constraints on themselves. And so I think we can interpret it that way, at least we do in this paper. We interpret it that way, and I think that's very important. In terms of whether it's a paper about Greece or about testing the model, it's clearly a paper about Greece. It's, and I think it's explaining this, but I think it's a paper about Greece that teaches us about the rule of law and trade-offs about the rule of law that I do not think are well analyzed. At least I haven't seen them analyzed like that anywhere. We didn't start out with this particular model in mind. In fact, we have been through many iterations of this paper. Each time we started to write this paper, it turned into another paper. So the paper that I talked about, expertise, that started off on the same subject, and I realized no, and that peeled off and became about expertise. And then we have a paper about wealth-enhancing democracy, that peeled off. And so this is sort of what we were left with. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, it really broke down into these several different things. And I think this is a really interesting and highlights a trade-off about the rule of law that we ourselves didn't fully appreciate when we started working on it. So I think the notion of testing the model on a bigger data set is a really good one, and it's one that we want to think about, because I think it is an interesting model that should apply. If it's a good model, it should apply other places too. But this paper right now is really about this particular instance of doing that and using that as a way to motivate this model. Now whether we benefit from exploring a few other examples. You suggested marriage or something else. That's a good question. That's something we'll think about.
I've got Nabila, and then.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I actually had a question. Well, I have two intertwined questions that kind of touch on this last point that you just made. Basically, I, in my head, automatically started trying to apply this model to more contemporary examples, and I thought, especially of developing countries, and just kind of the way people tend to think about rule of law over there. And I realized that the definition of rule of law that seems to be applicable more to modern day development, I guess, literature, or at least the discourse that exists over there, is a little bit different from the paper here. And I was wondering if you could speak more about your definition of rule of law, which is more about the citizenry kind of credibly committing to itself, rather than, I guess, abidance or deviation from the law as stated, which I feel like is perhaps the more present or popular understanding of rule of law.
Well, I think that we're talking in our particular circumstance about a citizenry. I think the model is equally applicable to a representative democracy or to an oligarchy or to a dictatorship. I mean, I think that there are gains from committing to policy, and there are costs to committing to policy, and I think those are common across all different types of government. Now, one of the things about studying the rule of law, you realize very quickly, is defining the rule of law is very difficult. And actually, my favorite definition is Barry Weingast, where he says it's a set of stable political rules applied impartially to all citizens. And so I think the rule of law really has two components. The notion that it's a stable set of rules, and this is where, what was the term? Cumbersome comes in. It makes, making processes for changing rules cumbersome, you make them stable. I mean, that's what we really have in most countries with the rule of law. It's cumbersome processes for changing them. And then you apply it, impartially across all citizens. In other words, all are equal under the law. Those are really the two elements. I think they're very closely linked elements. It's hard to imagine a stable set of rules that are not implied impartially to all citizens, because at that point I don't know what the stability is. I suppose they could be applied consistently differently across different groups, maybe a sort of a Jim Crow style law. I'm not quite sure whether you call that a rule of law or not. So the two are very linked in that sense, and I think that's so. And I think so let's say that's what we're sort of thinking of with the rule of law, and really focusing on the first part, the stability. And I think that for any regime, there are gains and there are costs to establishing that stability. You're tying your own hands. Now, I think it's hard to tie one's own hands. It's hard for democracy to tie its own hands. I mean, that's one of the questions: is how do you maintain a stable rule of law? Barry Weingast, in the same article, suggests it's got to be self-enforcing. That's very difficult to do in many circumstances. So I think you have this challenge. You have this interesting question. This is moving well beyond our paper here, but you have this interesting question, which is a lot of evidence that rule of law states are wealthier, and a lot of reluctance among states, or an inability among a lot of states to establish a rule of law, and that's been attributed to maybe self-interested behavior on the part of elites. But it may also, one of the things our model suggests that I think is interesting, we don't push this as far as we might, is that the rule of law is endogenous. Okay, it suggests the possibility, at least it's not randomly established. It's established at places where the gains are going to be the largest. And if that's the case, then you may wonder whether, maybe there's some element of that too. But our model would make another prediction, which is as the gains to establishing a rule of law increase, the likelihood of establishing a rule of law should increase. And I think that's one of the things we'll see. Increasingly innovation and investment, I mean, that's the key to wealth. And countries, as that becomes more and more and more important, well, we see more and more countries moving to a rule of law circumstance. And I think that is that's a really interesting question.
Okay, Dean and Claudia.
So this is my question. So first, I want to thank you for coming here for the whole semester, actually. And second, following on Jimmy's point, I think you're kind of trying to jam Athens into this model. But you say the paper is about Greece. That's not a test of the model per se. So why not a slightly different approach and just give you a new title of the paper? So instead of entering the rule of law, I see the paper more as how the Peloponnesian War changed the structure of the Athenian government. And there's dimensions of it here that are rule of law-ish, and maybe the scope of government changed too, which wouldn't surprise me. The Navy becomes less important, so you don't have as many admirals and so forth. No, he doesn't. I don't know what the facts are, but something changes in things change in the economy, and the scope of government may have changed as well as some of the I don't know what you're calling the rule of law stuff. And I also think you should link these empirical measures of the rule of law that are out there in the literature that you cite. Talk about those a little more explicitly and how they do or do not fit the Greek situation here. That's a slightly different kind of paper, and also I think links to Gustavo's point that there are a little more nuances in the structure of government here than just what you're trying to. It seems like you're trying to force into the model. The model can still be there as a guide, but I don't think you need to be as fixated on it. Maybe.
Well, we could give that some thought, but I mean, quite contrary to jamming the history into the model flowed out of the history. We had the history first, and the model was actually not our first explanation for the history. We found this interesting institutional change, and we were trying to understand it. So the model does come directly from the history, and I think you're again overemphasizing. I mean, in our appendix, we go through the institutional changes in I think as much detail as there is. I mean, obviously people write books on it, so that's an exaggeration. But I think we go through them fairly carefully. So it's not. I don't think there's a lot of institutions out there that we're not discussing in our paper. I mean, the institutions that we know are mostly there in this paper, the ones that are relevant here, and I think we're characterizing Athens fairly directly. Now, I think we could have a title that is, how the Peloponnesian War changed ancient Athens, because basically what we're arguing is that the loss of empire, it's not the Peloponnesian War per se, but the loss of empire is what changed the incentives to establish commitment. By raising the benefits from establishing commitment, they inspired the Athenians to establish different institutions. And that really is our paper. Now, perhaps engineering the rule of law in ancient Athens is too gaudy a title for that. That's really our story. Our story is that what happened was after they lost their empire, the gains to committing became much greater, and they established a number of institutions that look remarkably like what modern states do to establish commitment by defining clearly what the law is and making it cumbersome to change the law. And that in a nutshell is our story. So I think it is a story about the rule of law, and it's also a story about Athens, but I think it's also a model that would apply to more places, and I think the notion of trying to test it on more things is certainly a very good one, and one that we can pursue.
Claudia.
Thank you. Interesting paper, and I keep wondering, I study developing countries about what explains the rule of law in developing countries, and you mentioned that this is an endogenous thing, and it's true, and always when we try to explain that, reviewers say, why, how do you deal with this endogeneity issue? And I wonder whether this is contingent on party system and electoral roles, because probably politicians or citizens are more likely to establish this commitment based on how many parties actually are in the party system and what are the electoral rules. I am allowed to run for re-election or not. Otherwise, if I am allowed to run for re-election indefinitely, probably there will not be too much incentives to establish these commitments because they will be also forced to obey them. So I wondered, how do you factor this into this rule of law?
I think that's a very good question. I think your question highlights the fact that one of the reasons it's hard to define the rule of law is there are many institutional ways to the rule of law. Because again, if we think of the rule of law as, Barry Weindass said, a stable set of rules, okay, how can you create a stable set of rules? Well, one way you do it in the United States is you have a separation of powers system. You have an independent judiciary, a legislative body and a presidential body, that are all have their own separate powers and that can all serve as checks at each other. That's not the way it works in a parliamentary democracy like the UK. The rule of law works in a very different way there. Now, does that mean that one way is right, the other is not? No, I think they're just different. These are all ways of committing, of making laws stable, of making the process of changing laws cumbersome. Seems to me the big problem in a lot of countries, a lot of Latin American countries in particular, is not so much that they've got particular electoral rules per se, but rather somebody gets in there with a large electoral mandate, and what do? They throw out the old constitution and they change the rules. And so there's no commitment to a set of underlying rules. And that's the big problem, that's the big challenge, and that's the big puzzle. And this comes back again to Barry Weingast talking about it being self-enforcing. All that does is it pushes that puzzle back one step. So why is it self-enforcing in the United States and Britain and a number of Western countries? Why is it not self-enforcing in so many Latin American countries? And I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's a fascinating question.
Scott, last question, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, just a really quick one. I really enjoyed the paper and the talk today. Thank you. Just really quick, at the end of the paper, you talk a little bit about the European Union and modern Greece, and just maybe as a quick way to wrap up. And as you mentioned already, you're thinking already about different ways you can test this model going forward. I was curious what your thoughts were, beyond maybe Greece itself, about what this portends for other countries and the debates going on right now about the future of the Eurozone and the importance of localized control in some cases and supranational control in others. I'm thinking of the France elections and others coming up, and how this could inform some of that.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I don't know that it necessarily informs a lot of that. I think that there's a feeling among a lot of monetary experts, and I'm not one of them, that this was a bad, single currency zone to begin with. And I think that's the fundamental problems they're dealing with. They're not really rule of law problems, but rather the problems of having one entity setting monetary policy while all the local entities set fiscal policy. However, that said, I do think there are some interesting modern examples, and one that I find particularly interesting is China, because China is a country that has become very wealthy over the last several decades. Sure. But initially, mostly through a capital deepening process and through bringing people, underemployed people in from the countryside to the city. Today, China is, and in the future, China presumably is going to depend much more on innovation and investment, and whether that's going to. China somehow has managed to establish some kind of commitment to property rights in an informal way that's hard for us to define, for Western scholars to define, because it looks very different than we see in the West. But this would be a circumstance where the gains to committing presumably are increasing dramatically for China if it wants to become a country that innovates rather than just a country that sort of amasses capital and people to produce. And so I think that that the prediction of the model will be that they will, as the returns go up, that they will, that the gains to implementing rule of law will rise correspondingly, and therefore they'll be more likely to establish some kind of a more formal rule of law. We'll see. I think.
I'm going to come back in a second to you for the last word. Before we get there, I want to thank you all for coming today. And I want to remind you that, as Dean said, Andy is going to be here for the entire semester as a visiting scholar at the workshop. If you have a burning question about ancient Athens, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And Andy will reply. Andy, last word.
I just thank you very much. A lot of really excellent comments. He gave me stuff to think about. We're in the process of revising the paper, and I think that is going to come in very, very handy. And if you have anything else you'd like to say at any point, please feel free to stop by. I'm on the 3rd floor upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.